So if you're a very shy person, you want to become more outgoing, that is totally possible. And speaking of possible, we have another component of ourself known as the possible self. So if you think about, and the way I like to illustrate this in my mind's eye, is I like to think about one bubble, that is our self-concept. And these are the things who we are right now. But then we have lots of little bubbles, kind of like in a fizzy drink, floating around that represent all the possible selves we could be. And so they're not part of who we are yet, but we could become those things. And so this is a theory that was brought up by Hazel Marcus and Paula Nurius. And so their theory is the idea that outside of who we are right now, there's all these futuristic possible selves we could entertain. And you can think of them all just floating in separate little bubbles and kind of all these different dreams floating around. I put a couple of them in one bubble just for illustrative purposes. So possible self is the idea of who you could become. You're not necessarily going to become these things, but they're possibilities for growth in the future. So maybe you'll become a gourmet chef, or maybe you'll start to learn how to drive a motorcycle. Maybe you'll take up painting or run for politics or become an astronaut or adopt a few kittens. These are lots of different things you could be. And I don't have a lot of personality traits in here because they're harder to describe, but it might be you want to become more outgoing, or maybe you want to become more conscientious or less emotionally reactive or more open to new experiences. We definitely could find those in your possible selves. Now there's two subtypes of possible selves that are really worth talking about, and these are the ought self and the ideal self. So we're going to talk about the ought self first. The ought self is a subtype of possible selves. It's a special bubble out there, or multiple bubbles out there, but the ought self is a possible self that is derived through external pressure. That is, the ought self is something that other people want you to become. So this is not something you especially want for yourself. This is something that your family or your boss or your culture wants for you. And so this might be the idea that they want you to get married, they want you to have kids, they want you to become a doctor. And so what we find is the ought self is this external pressure. And when you don't reach this, when you don't become the ought self, we tend to feel a lot of guilt and shame and anxiety. And that's because this is really linked with the behavioral inhibition system. This is the idea that it's linked with our fear circuit in our brain, and it's linked with what we consider performance goal motivation. This is the idea that you're only interested in doing these things to make other people's approval of you increase. And so this is not something you want for yourself, you just want it to please others. That's the ought self. Then we have the ideal self. So the ideal self is also a special subtype of the possible self, and this is one that's derived from internal pressure. These are the goals you made up for you that other people didn't put on you, that you really want. And so this might be, you're not interested in getting married or having babies, but maybe you want to be a hockey player. Maybe you want to climb mountains. Maybe you want lots of money and drive fast cars. And that's the type of future you want for yourself. And so when you don't achieve these things, rather than feeling guilt and shame and anxiety, if we don't get to the ideal self, we tend to feel sadness, disappointment, and grief. And rather than being linked with our behavioral inhibition system and our fear circuits, we find that the ideal self is linked with our behavioral activation system, known as our BAS, and our mastery goal orientation. This is the idea that we're really fascinated with trying to do these things just to do them. We're not interested in doing it to please others or to get other people's approval. We want to do these things because we want to do these things. We're more intrinsically motivated towards them, and they excite us. All right, so that was our self-concept or self-representation. Next, we're going to go into how we describe our self-concept or self-representation. This is a really brief slide, as you can see, but basically we might have all these ideas of who we are, but not be able to put them into words. And so the way we construct the words around who we are is our personal narrative. And this is different than what's internal. Although our self-concept is conscious, it might be conscious but hard to explain, or hard to draw, or hard to communicate. And so the personal narrative is how we can communicate who we are. And it's not just about who we are now, but our personal narrative also includes who we were in the past. So our recollection of personal events and our personal memories. When you think back to your childhood and you think back to an event, you may have viewed yourself as the victim, or you may have viewed yourself as the bully, or you may have viewed yourself as the hero. And other people who experience the same events as you might view you as very different in certain situations. And so the way you view yourself is a component of this personal narrative. We're going to talk more about personal narratives when we get to the development of the self. Right now we're just introducing the 5 components of the self.